Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 1 in the cell biology booklet. This is on prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Um, Before we get started, I'd just like to remind you to make sure you have either a digital or a paper copy of this lesson. If you don't, please make sure that you email your teacher and make sure that you have that ready in front of you. We're going to be highlighting and making annotations on the side. Probably not as much as you would if you were in a real classroom. But please make sure that you have them ready next to you so that you are ready to go. And as with always, there's going to be a do now. So we can pause the video now and get started on that, please. Right. So all of these are true and false questions, so you just have to put T or F. And please make sure that you take out your green or red pen and make sure that you are correcting as you move along. So the first one says, all living organisms fall into one of 5 groups. This is going to be true, as we are going to learn today. Number 2 says, one of these groups is mammals. This is actually false. Okay. An independent variable is the one that you change. This is true. Okay. Number 4, plant and animal cells contain all the same subcellular components. This is going to be false, and it might be a reminder from previous lessons. Number 5, all bacteria cause illnesses. This is false. You actually have bacteria inside your body that help you digest things. Number 6, every living organism contains cells. This is true. Number 7, a millimeter is smaller than a micrometer. This is actually false. A micrometer is much, much smaller than a millimeter. And Mn is the symbol for magnesium on the periodic table. This is false because Mn stands for manganese. Okay, so if you need a little bit more extra time, you can pause the video and make sure that you have all the answers. But if you're good to go, then you can move on to the next slide, which is the overview of what we're going to learn today. Okay, so we're going to make sure that by the end of this lesson, you should know that a eukaryotic cell contains a membrane-bound nucleus, and you should be able to give examples, as well as know that bacterial cells are prokaryotic with no nucleus and are much smaller than eukaryotic cells. So if a lot of this doesn't make sense to you right now, don't worry about it. You'll be learning as you go along, and let's get started. Okay, so you can follow along in the booklet here. I have the line numbers on the side so that you don't get lost. So the first thing we're going to learn about is eukaryotes. Okay, now you actually know quite a bit about eukaryotes already, but if you don't, that's fine. I'm going to go over it a little bit here. Okay, so on line 10 it starts off by saying, as humans we like to sort things and we can place everything into groups, and we start with living and non-living. All right, and from there we can split it into 5 more groups. Okay, so on the non-living side, it makes a lot of sense. You know, things like metals, minerals, things like these are not living, whereas you have plants and animals. Okay, so of the living organisms, we can split them into 5 more groups. Okay, and those 5 groups are going to be animals, plants, fungi, protists, and bacteria. So going back to the do now, mammals isn't actually one of the 5 groups because mammals are just animals. Okay, so I want you to start off by highlighting this section here, okay, or underline it, and that's going to be quite an important thing. Okay, you're going to need to know all 5 of those groups. And moving on, all living organisms are made up of cells, whether single or multiple. Okay, and the cells themselves can differ between organisms. This is going to be a lot of information, but we're going to look into cell differentiation in another lesson. Okay, but again, I want you to go ahead and highlight that sentence right there again. Okay, so all living organisms are made up of cells, okay? And they can be single, which we call single cell organisms, or they can be multiple, which we call multicellular organisms, okay? All right, and on line 14, as we continue along, animals, plants, fungi, and protists can be categorized as eukaryotic, from the Greek eu, meaning good/true, okay? And the karyote part of it means nut, referring to the membrane-bound nucleus. So I'm going to show you a picture of a eukaryote in the next slide here, and you'll notice that the nucleus kind of looks like a very circular part of the entire cell. Okay, and just for reference, eukaryotic cells are range between 10 and 100 micrometers in diameter, which is extremely, extremely small. Okay, you definitely need a microscope to see cells like that. Okay, and just to go back to the living organisms, all right, if it's living, all right, it's pretty much guaranteed that it's made up of cells, all right? And as you know, cells are the building blocks of all living things, not dead things. So things like your dressers, your bed, these are not living things. So they're not made up of cells, they're made up of whatever material they're made up of, the element, okay? All right. Um, and the last thing that I want you to underline here are these 5 organelles. Okay, so animal cells contain subcellular structures called organelles. Okay, so the way I explain this to most of my students is that your body consists of organs, right? So you have a heart, you have lungs, you have stomach. These are organs that help you survive. Cells have the same thing. They have their own organs. We just call them organelles, which literally means tiny organs. And the 5 that hopefully you remember from previous years are things like cytoplasm, cell membrane, mitochondria, and ribosome. All right, and we are going to look into the functions of these. So if you forgot them, don't worry. I'm going to go over them later on in the PowerPoint today. Okay. All right. So I'm going to show you the picture that's in your booklet right now, and it looks something like this. Now you might notice that it doesn't look very nice because it's kind of blurry. So I found kind of a better picture. It looks like this, but it has all the same. It has all the same parts. Okay. So before we begin, I want to start off with a note on the side here, okay? So there are organelles that you will see on this picture that you do not need to know, all right? So things like the centrosome, the nucleolus, lysosome, the rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulum, these are just things that the cell does have, but you don't need to know at this moment for the level that you're studying at right now, okay? But the things that I do want you to notice are the 5 organelles that we listed off earlier. And that's going to be your cell membrane, which is the outer layer right here, the cytoplasm, which is all the kind of grayish stuff on the inside, the ribosome, which are these little dots, and you'll notice that you just don't find them in one space, but they are spread out over the entire cell, okay? They're like little dots. The next one is going to be mitochondrion, which is the singular form of the word you might have heard it as mitochondria, which is plural. Okay, and so those are the pink little oval-shaped structures there that have lines going throughout the middle. And the last one is going to be the nucleus, okay, which is going to be the center part of your cell here. Okay, so those 5 parts of the animal cell, I need you guys to remember this, all right? And if you want to highlight them on your picture of the cell diagram in your booklets, by all means do that, okay? The next part here, we're going to be, again, be looking at another cell, but this one is going to be a plant cell, okay? So a majority of this should feel a little bit like review, all right? But if it doesn't, this is the reason why I'm doing this, okay? So plant cells and animal cells are very, very similar. Okay, so on line 2, it'll say that plants also contain other subcellular structures or organelles, which include cytoplasm, cell membrane, mitochondria, and ribosome. Okay, and like I said, you can find these in both plants and animals, but plants have a little bit more. Okay, so they have more specialized organelles called the cell wall, permanent vacuole, and chloroplast. Okay, so again, this picture right here doesn't really do it justice because it's a little bit blurry. I wasn't able to find a higher definition photo of it, so I found another photo like this. Okay, so same thing, you're going to have the exact same organelles as the animal cell, which is your cytoplasm, which is that inner stuff, all that stuff inside that holds everything together. Your nucleus, still the same, okay, kind of like the brain of your cell. Your ribosomes are like the little dots that you see here and there, okay, and they are very, very small. Your mitochondria, again, those kind of bean oval shaped structures with the lines going inside them. And lastly, your cell membrane, which is the outer layer. Now you'll notice that the plant cell has something outside of the cell membrane, okay? That's going to be your cell wall, okay? So the ones I have highlighted in green are the ones that you can only find in plant cells. So those are going to be your chloroplasts, okay, which are these green structures here that looks like they have, they look like they have pancakes inside them. That's how I've always learned them. So green oval shaped structures with kind of a pancake structure inside of them. All right. So don't get those mixed up with your mitochondria. The next one is going to be your vacuole, which looks like a huge little bubble inside plant cells. Okay, and I'll explain what that does in a second here. And the last one is going to be that structure I just talked about, the cell wall, which is outside of your cell membrane, and that's responsible for keeping the cell structure very rigid and gives it support. Okay, so just to remind you, what we've discovered so far about animal and plant cells, these are eukaryotes. Okay, and just to remind you, eukaryotes have a nucleus that is bound, all right, or inside of a membrane. Now, I'm not talking about the membrane outside. I'm more or less talking about the membrane. If you look at the nucleus, there's going to be a purple dotted circle. Okay, that's a membrane, which means that the contents of the nucleus cannot go outside of that. Okay, at least not by itself. So if we look at prokaryotes, now I'm not gonna get another photo because you can kind of tell prokaryotes from this. You'll see that it's very different. Okay, the first thing you'll notice is it has much less organelles than a eukaryote. Okay, and that's because bacteria have a different way of living. Okay, they can get their energy in different ways, but that's not to say that they are completely different. Okay, so prokaryotes are thought to have been the only type of life on Earth for millions of years. Okay, and bacteria are kind of their own little group. So the word prokaryote sounds a lot like eukaryote. Okay, but prokaryotes are just basically organisms that don't have a cell nucleus. Okay, so that's the part I'm going to have you highlight here on lines 11 and 12. So the biggest difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes are going to be that the nucleus, all right, is not going to be inside of a membrane. So you don't see on the diagram here that there's any nucleus, right? So this is because that inside the nucleus of a eukaryote contains genetic material, the DNA. All right, and that DNA basically tells that cell how to behave, how it controls itself. Whereas on bacteria, it doesn't have a nucleus, but it actually has something called chromosomes. Okay, and that's at this part right here. Okay, and chromosomes are these long coils. Okay, chromosomes are long coils of DNA, which stand for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's a really long name, but it'll help if you remember it. Okay, and these make up your genes. All right, so you actually have chromosomes. All right, not bacterial chromosomes, but you actually have chromosomes inside your nucleus. All right, and these chromosomes can define who you are as a person, what you look like. So, for example, you have chromosomes that determine your eye color. So, if you have blue eyes, you have chromosomes that are different from someone who has brown eyes. Okay, so that's the biggest difference here, is that the chromosomes are not inside of any nucleus other than the cell membrane. So most prokaryotes, I'm continuing on line 13 here, most prokaryotes are unicellular, but some prokaryotes can be multicellular. Okay, and as I mentioned before, some of the basic organelles are similar to what you know from plants and animals, and bacteria cells are on average between 1 and 10 micrometers. So this is in comparison to eukaryotic cells, which can grow up to 100 micrometers, which that means that prokaryotes are much smaller than eukaryotes. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going to the next part here, which talks about all the different functions of the organelles that we just talked about. Okay, so the subcellular structures all play a very important role in each cell, having their own specific function. All right, so let's go through a lot of these. The first one that we're going to talk about is the cell membrane. So, excuse me. The cell membrane holds the cell together and controls which substances move in and outside the cell. All right. Now, I've always mentioned this cell membrane to be kind of like the skin of the cell, and that's not really a good comparison because, yes, as like the skin, it holds all your organs inside your body, but it doesn't really control what enters and leaves your cell, right? That's more or less through your nose and your mouth. So there are things that do move in and out of the cell membrane through movements like diffusion, okay? And if you've forgotten what diffusion is, look back to one of the earlier videos, or you find it on the TNA Science YouTube channel. But diffusion is basically that movement from high concentration to low concentration. And that's kind of how oxygen gets into your lungs, right, into your bloodstream, because you have a low concentration of oxygen inside your bloodstream if you're breathing out. So that will kind of allow oxygen to diffuse into your veins and your blood and your arteries. Okay. The next part here is going to be your nucleus. So your nucleus contains genetic material. Now, genetic material is also known as DNA, which again stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. All right. So your nucleus controls everything that happens inside your cell. If you didn't have a nucleus, or if you didn't have DNA, the cell basically would have no purpose. It would just kind of be there. So think of DNA or the nucleus as kind of like the recipe or the cookbook of your cell. It has a list of instructions that your cell needs to follow, right? And if it doesn't follow it, then your cell will die. All right. The cytoplasm, not much to say there, except that it's basically kind of all the fluid that's inside the cell membrane, and it contains enzymes that control chemical reactions, and the cytoplasm is where most of your reactions are going to occur. All right, makes sense because cytoplasm is kind of all that stuff inside the cell. The mitochondria. If you've ever heard of mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell, this is the reason why. Because you have that one of the 7 life processes, respiration, and that is the ability to obtain or use energy with the help of oxygen. Okay, so this produces all the energy inside the cell. All right, if you did not have mitochondria, you would not be able to have energy. And you'll notice that inside the cell, if you look at the past diagrams, you'll notice that every cell, plant and animal, has not just one mitochondria, but it has multiple mitochondria. Okay, so that's just because if your cell needs to use up more energy, it has a mitochondria to spare. And the last one is going to be ribosomes. So again, ribosomes are going to be the really, really small dots inside of the cells, and this is the site of protein synthesis. Now, I've had a lot of students in the past struggle with this because they don't really know what synthesis means, okay? So synthesis it basically means to create, all right? That's why we call it synthetic material. That's because it's not really natural. We can make it. So synthesis means to create. So if you just type in protein synthesis, this just means protein creation. So a large portion of your body is made up of different types of proteins. So I'm going to use your muscles as an example, right? If you've ever heard of like bodybuilders, right, they need to eat lots of food in order to keep the calorie count. But it's not just how much they eat, it also matters of what they eat. So you might notice that a lot of bodybuilders need to have lots of protein to build up their muscles, okay? And that makes sense because your muscles are made up of really, really small proteins, okay? So your cells are essentially overworking their ribosomes because they want as much protein as possible, okay? So again, please make sure that you have these annotations in your booklets. You can write them on the sides, okay? Or if you have a separate booklet or a little notebook, that you can make these notes on the side, okay? All right, moving down. So some of these are going to be in your prokaryote section, but I'll let you know where that is. So make sure that you're looking back at the diagrams as I'm going through these so that you have a visual of what you're supposed to be looking at. The next one is going to be the cell wall. So this is only found in plant cells, and it's a rigid, rigid cellulose structure that supports and strengthens the cell. So this cellulose is actually quite important because cellulose is a substance that is quite hard, all right? And you can notice cells because when you, say for example, break a stick of celery, it makes a nice snapping noise. So what you're doing is you're breaking apart all the cellulose inside that celery. And just so you know, cellulose is not digestible, so it kind of moves through you quite unchanged. Okay, So cell wall, quite important, very, very strong. The next one is the permanent vacuole. So that's the one that kind of looks like a large bubble inside the plant cell. So the permanent vacuole contains a weak sugar salt solution called cell sap. Now, cell sap is actually quite important because the solution there, the weak sugar salt solution, is kind of like food storage for plants. So, for instance, if a plant did not receive any sunlight, did not receive any water for a really long time, what it will do is it will use up the cell sap inside of its cells first, okay? And then once it uses all that up, then it will die, okay? So it's kind of like backup storage for your plant cells, all right? The next one is chloroplasts. So again, this one you can only find inside plant cells, and this is where photosynthesis occurs. And if you forgot what photosynthesis is, you might want to brush up on that a bit because you're going to be hearing that quite a bit in science when we ever do biology like this, okay? So just to give you a recap, photosynthesis is that process of converting sunlight energy into usable energy for the plant, right? And I'll show you a picture of the chloroplasts from a better angle, because these are the ones that I mentioned were the green structures that look like they have pancakes inside them. But from a 2D point of view, you couldn't really tell it. So here's a 3D version of that. So you see it kind of looks like pancakes stacked upon each other, all right? And chloroplasts are made up of this substance called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is actually why most plants are green, okay? And that green part is actually what absorbs the sunlight. All right. Flagellum is a tail that enables movement of the cell. So flagellum you can only find in prokaryotes. So if you look back at the prokaryote or bacteria cell, you'll notice that it has two really long tails coming out the back. So what the flagellum does is it uses the energy produced from the mitochondria to whip around, and that whipping motion actually propels the bacteria forward. Okay. Chromosomes. So again, chromosomes are a long strand of DNA in a bacteria cell, and you can find chromosomes inside the nucleus, or you can find it inside a bacteria cell as well, just not inside the nucleus. Okay. Now, plasmids. You're gonna get into plasmids later on, but plasmids are just basically it's the same DNA, but it's in a ring formation now. Okay, so I'll show you a picture of what it looks like. So plasmids are actually quite interesting because plasmids are the reason why bacteria can be infectious. So there's nothing much more that I can really tell you other than the fact that it's a simple ring of DNA, and it's not enclosed in a membrane. But you'll notice how plasmids have a section of DNA that they can basically attach on from other things. So this is the reason why most bacteria will actually release their plasmids into your bloodstream or wherever, and it gets transported elsewhere, and that DNA can get into different cells, and instead of using the DNA from the nucleus, it'll use the DNA from the plasmid to, do whatever it needs to do. So it's kind of like if you took out a page from the cookbook, right, the recipe, and you put in your own instructions, okay, for your own gain. So it's not very good for the cell of the organism that it's in, but, life goes on, okay? Like I said, you're going to get into plasmids much, much later on in science. All right, and we get to this checkpoint here. So the question says, describe the differences between the way genetic material is stored in prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. And this is worth 4 marks, okay? So before you begin, I just want to make sure that you have all the information that you need to, right? So you're looking at prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and you know that the way that the genetic material, or the DNA, okay, the way that the DNA is stored is different. All right, so since it's worth 4 marks, all right, I expect 4 separate points as to how prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells are different as to how, what they do with their DNA or how they store their DNA, okay? So pause the video now really quickly and get started on that. You can put this in point form or full sentences, doesn't matter. Right. So the first thing that you're going to probably notice is that eukaryotic cells have their genetic material inside of a nucleus, right? It's bound inside of a membrane. That's what it means to be inside of a nucleus. The next part is that eukaryotes have DNA coiled up into chromosomes. Okay. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a different one because prokaryotes can have chromosomes, but not exclusively, right? Prokaryotes can have DNA that is also in plasmids. And that's going to be actually my next point. Prokaryotes carry plasmids that can be duplicated into different cells, okay? And the last one is that prokaryotic cells generally have less DNA than eukaryotic cells. So this one you might have had to think a little bit more because I've told you earlier that prokaryotes are much smaller than eukaryotes, okay? So consequently, most of their organelles or most of their parts are going to be much smaller in comparison, okay? So please make sure that you have all these written down. So, and if you don't, pause the video right now and you can do that, okay? But if you have everything written down and you got them all correct, you can move on. So the next part is going to be labeling this cell here. Now it doesn't tell you if it's a plant cell or an animal cell, but that's okay. All right. Most of this you can kind of figure out that just by looking at the shape and how many of them there are. You should be able to discern or figure out what you're looking at. Okay. So again, pause the video really quickly and make sure you fill in all the different parts here, okay? All right, and once you're done with that, we're going to go through the answers here, okay? So the first one, I'm going to go from the top here. The first one you're going to find out is the cell wall, okay? And this is because the cell wall is outside of the cell membrane, okay? So you'll notice that most of the organelles are contained inside two different membranes, okay? Or two different little structures, okay? So the first one is going to be your cell wall. The next one is going to be your cell membrane, okay? So make sure you know the difference between the two. So now that you got that figured out, you know for a fact that this is going to be a plant cell, right? Because animal cells don't have a cell wall. So this large black circle here, right? There's only one of them. And like most images before, this part, the nucleus, was circular, okay, in plant cells at least. All right, and there's only one nucleus. You can't have more than two nuclei, right, in one cell. Okay, so the next one here is pointing to the little dots that are found all within the cell. Okay, now if that sounds familiar, that's because this is the ribosome, okay, or ribosomes for plural. All right, next one here is going to be these oval green-shaped structures. Okay. And we're talking about plant cells, so that should be pretty self-explanatory. This is going to be your chloroplasts, okay? And notice how there's not only one of them, okay? There's actually lots of chloroplasts, and that's just to make sure that you can just absorb as much sunlight as you can and convert them into energy, okay? All right, the next one is pointing to kind of like the fluid or the substance inside of the cell where everything is kind of resting in, okay? And that's going to be your cytoplasm. The next one is pointing to the large, weird shape in the center of the cell. And the size of it actually is a giveaway because this is the permanent vacuole. And the permanent vacuole actually takes up quite a bit of space inside of the plant cell. Okay. And the last one is these blue structures. Not very good because if I were to do this, I would have made these the same shape as the chloroplast but a different color, and that's the mitochondria. Okay. Underneath this diagram, you'll notice that it asks you to write in the functions of all of these different organelles. I've gone ahead and already done that for you. All right. So make sure that you do have these memorized, all right, because these are going to be a very important part of assessments, knowing what each of them do. Also, it doesn't hurt to know which ones you can find in which type of cells. So for example, if I showed you a picture of this diagram here, okay, then you should be able to tell me right away that you know that it's a plant cell because you can find chloroplasts in it, okay? All right. And the last thing I'm going to do is finishing up with a knowledge check. All right. So make sure that you take the time right now, pause the video, and get started on the knowledge check before the end of the lesson. Brilliant. So, number one, state which is bigger, a eukaryote or a prokaryote. So, as we mentioned before, this one is going to be your eukaryote. Number two, identify the difference between a eukaryote and a prokaryote. So, you can actually list quite a bit. You can actually say, a eukaryote is much bigger than a prokaryote, right? But you want to hit kind of the heart of the problem, and that is that a eukaryote has a nucleus that is bound in a membrane, whereas a prokaryote does not. Okay? All right. Number three, state what the cytoplasm contains to support reactions. This is going to be enzymes. All right? And I know I didn't mention it before, but I'll mention it now. Enzymes are what's known as catalysts. Okay? And a catalyst speeds up chemical reactions. So a really good example is if you leave an apple out on a counter and you don't cut it, it's going to take quite a bit to rot, right? It'll take maybe a week. But if you cut the apple in half or into the small little bits, you'll notice that it rots much, much faster. And that's because when you cut the apple open, you are releasing enzymes, okay, onto the surface of the apple. And that apple will start to decay much faster or rot much faster because the enzymes are speeding up that chemical reaction of rotting. All right? Moving on to number four. What are cell walls made out of? That is cellulose. Number five, state the function of the ribosome. So ribosomes are the site of protein synthesis or protein creation. Try to use the scientific terms, okay? Don't just put site of protein creation. You want to hit the points as hard as you can, okay? Number six, identify the subcellular component, okay? So organelle that a plant and a bacteria contain, but an animal does not. So this one is going to be a cell wall. So make sure you study the diagrams very closely and see which ones you can find in every type of cell. Okay. Number seven, state the function of the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is the site of respiration, or you can write down to produce energy for the cell. I would accept either one of those. Number eight, identify the function of the nucleus. So the nucleus contains all the genetic material which controls the activities of that cell, right? So I really like the example that I use as a cookbook, right? Because a cookbook contains recipes and instructions. And the last one is going to be number nine. If bacteria have no mitochondria, how do they get their energy to move? All right. So I didn't mention this because this is kind of one of those extended questions. But basically, bacteria usually get their energy from the host that they live in. So you could call them parasitic if you'd like, because parasites can only survive if the host that they are attached to gives them energy. But most bacteria usually get their energy from the host that they live in. So host just means whatever they're living in. It can be an animal, it could be a plant. But for instance, for yourself, you have bacteria living inside. The most place you have your bacteria is your intestines. And your intestines are full of bacteria that break down the food even more so that your body can absorb them, okay? But bacteria can actually benefit off of that and obtain energy from the food that you eat, okay? So eating good food will help your gut bacteria live much healthier, but if you eat bad food all the time, then your gut bacteria will kind of not flourish, okay? And that's pretty much it. So make sure you have all the correct annotations and the correct answers for the Duna and the knowledge check, and thank you for watching.